You're probably wondering where's Clint at this time. If you're confused about Clint and I's rotation, don't worry, we are too. We are able to intertwine, and I appreciate Clint covering for me at the last minute last week. I was under the weather, so it's always a blessing to be able to do that and then hit the stride and be able to continue the work. So always appreciate him covering last minute for everybody else that's able to do that. But it's good to be back, and it's a blessing to be back. This morning, we're going to continue our series we started in January of dealing with handling life's problems and how to overcome those things. You know, we've talked about so many unique things to this point about life's problems, about things that all of us face, whether it be dealing with forgiveness or anger or bitterness or worry. We've talked about so many things that apply to us. And there's one topic in particular I've been working on for some time that we're going to present this morning that I think probably hits us near and dear. And I know for me, it's not one that I hear spoken of quite often, but how blessed we are to be able to have the Bible as our guiding source. This morning we're going to talk about overcoming chronic illness. I say that because some of you got up this morning and the very first thing you felt when you got up was, in one way or another, pain or discomfort or problems. And before your feet hit the floor, you already knew you were going to have problems. You maybe knew the kind of day that you would be having. Chronic illness is more than just physical sometimes. Sometimes it hits us mentally as well. There's issues that we deal with in life that we wake up every morning and they're unchanged. And you wake up and you kind of expect the day to go as it is because you've dealt with it for so long, whether it's the same back pain, the same joint pain, the same problems mentally. Maybe it's the same fog in your head that sleep was supposed to fix, but it didn't. All of us are probably touched at one time or another with either a personal problem with chronic illness or pain, or somebody we know that is very near and dear to us. And maybe we're one that has not yet experienced it, but at one time will. But there's no little doubt that it touches every single one of us. That there's those who have to do the math before you even get up and start your day. How much is this going to tax me? I know people that I love very dearly who have to make the question of whether or not they can even make it through worship, if they're even able to get up and make it out, and what it's going to do with them if they do. And one of the things that make it harder, and perhaps the hardest part of this, is that there are things in our life that are not necessarily fixed or fixable. And we may have dealt with the phrase and the cliche of being told by a lot of people that you'll get through it, or maybe you'll get better, just give it time, or maybe just stay positive. And maybe they mean very well, and I'm sure they do. But the reality with some of these problems is they are just simply problems that will not go away. And so it's the question of, as a Christian, how can I deal with and overcome these things? I knew a story, and I had a very dear sister in Christ that very dear to my heart, that told me that she had stopped asking for prayers because she felt like she was disappointing people by not getting better. And I thought, oh, that breaks your heart to wonder, to feel like we were burdened, but it definitely can be. And I know that it's very difficult for us at times to talk about a topic such as this, but one thing is clear in Scripture: this is a topic we can address scripturally. So the question for you and I this morning is very simple, and it is one that maybe is not, how do I get rid of this problem? But it is the question of, how do I live faithfully if this problem I have never goes away? If I have to continue to live with this, if I have to continue going through this. And before we are able to answer that question of how do I live faithfully, even if this is a problem that persists in my life, there is a deeper question than that we have to look at first. And the first place that I want you to look at with me this morning is in Job chapter 1. I'd ask you to get your Bibles out and be opening up to Job chapter 1, because in it we have the question behind the question behind how do I live faithfully through these problems. There is a question ultimately that is behind this that prompts us to the answer to our other question, but it is one that we have to establish first. And so I want you to begin looking at Job chapter 1. And I want you to think about the problem of Job chapter 1. And looking at verse number 9, the question for you and I is, does Job fear God for naught? And basically he's saying, does Job fear God for nothing? That comes from Job chapter 1 and verse number 9. And you'll notice who exactly says this in verse number 9. Who exactly is the one that begins this conversation? You'll notice that Job chapter 1 is an interesting book because it begins with a problem between Satan and God. And it begins with a perspective that Satan offers and a thought that the only reason that people serve God is because there is a paycheck to come from it. There is a benefit to come from it, whether that is physically or mentally. There is something we get in return from serving God. And so Satan is saying that the people only serve you, God, because you give them something out of it. And so the question that is asked in Job chapter 1 and verse number 9 is, does Job fear God for nothing? And that word there, for not, that word not means for nothing, freely, without payment. Will he serve God even if he gets nothing out of it? Will he continue to serve God? And so Satan's perspective is very simple. The words of Satan and the mindset of Satan is that nobody serves God for God. He says the only reason they serve God is because God offers something to them in return that they can be able to enjoy, that there are blessings that they have. And his point is if you remove the paycheck, if you remove those blessings, if you remove good health and wealth and these things that we have in life, then people will no longer serve God. That you take those things away, and that it will be seen that the only reason we worship God is because we get something in return. That is the question of Job chapter 1. And so his point is that to God, no, Job doesn't actually love you. He loves you because you give him something in return. And so his thought process is, strip all of those things away, and what do you have? Satan's perspective is you have a servant who will not be willing to serve you any longer. Now sit with this question for a second, because this is a question not of ancient history. This is a question of, does Job serve God for God? That is not a question asked by somebody way in the past. This is our question. This is our question today. And the question to the one suffering is the question of every morning you wake up hurting. The question is being asked again to you, will you serve God even through pain, illness, problems? Will you continue to serve God then? Because here's the question answered. If we serve God only when things are going our way, only when health is good, only when wealth is good, only when we don't have problems, or whenever the problem is resolved, then Satan is right. And Satan's point to God is right. That we only serve God because we get something in return. And if our faith only works when our body works, or when our mind works, is it really faith at all, or is it more of just a transaction? And so Satan's point for God is that, no, you strip all of these things away, God, and men will no longer serve you. And so I want you to skip down to Job chapter 1, verses 20 through 22. And I'm going to skip along there because a lot of things take place in Job chapter 1. One of the biggest things that happens is that God is so vindicating in Job's faith that he is willing to allow Satan to take these things away to prove to him that, no, Job is not one that just serves me when times are good. He will serve me even if he is suffering. And so by the time you get to Job chapter 1, verses 20 through 22, Job has lost his possessions. His children have died. He's lost his servants. He has lost his respect in the community. And in verses 20 through 21, specifically there in verse 21, it says, naked came I out of the mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. If you read the second part of verse number 21, and you go on over into verse number 22, it says, in all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. See, Job, you think whenever you read verse 21, that's a man that's just dealing with problems and just smiling through it. This is a man, as you read and you go back to verse 20, this is a man dealing with real grief. He is a man that has torn his robes, he has shaved his head, he has fallen to the ground in the ultimate grief. And he is looking at his life, but then he goes out and he worships God. And whenever he does that, he makes a statement in verse 21 that whether God gives or whether he takes away, he must be praised. So that is the answer then to Job's, or God's question, or Satan's question. Does Job serve God for nothing? Yes, Job fears God and will worship him, even when he has nothing left. So in verse 22, it says, in all of this, Job sinned not nor charged God foolishly. You know, the target that you and I have, the goal for Job was not necessarily relief from pain. It was faithfulness through the pain. You know, as you read through Job, one of the things that strikes me is that you have 40 plus chapters of Job dealing with these problems in his life, and the problems that he deals with never truly go away. He has these problems and he's dealing with these problems. And the other thing is Job never understands why. He's never given the answer to why he's going through these problems. He's never understanding the why behind why there is so much pain, why there's so many problems. And yet through it all, he does not seek after God for relief. He asks for faithfulness, and the goal for God is a man that is full of faith, even at the lowest of times. Does that describe me and you? Well, Satan's smart. And one thing that we maybe don't give Satan enough credit for is his intelligence of knowing how to tear us down. Because if you go to chapter 2 of Job, Satan thinks, well, if those things don't work, there's one thing that I know that will. And so you go into Job chapter 2, and specifically there you go into verses 4 and 5. Now Satan comes back, by the way. So you open up in Job chapter 2, Satan comes back. He's lost the first round because Job has lost his possessions, his children are dead, and yet Job is still a man that is worshiping God. And so now he escalates. And now in chapter 2, he says, you know what? If all of those things didn't work, I know what will. Now read verse 4 and 5. Skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath, will he give for his life. But put forth thine hand now, and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face. Now I want you to look at something here. Satan believes that health problems are our breaking point. He says, yes, he didn't fall away then. He didn't turn away from you then, but if you take away his health, then he'll have no choice but to turn his back on you. And every person in this room who lives with chronic illness is living proof of whether Satan is right or wrong. And as you see the question unfold of where our breaking point is, of where Satan believes our breaking point is, he curses now Job's health. And now Job is a man that is a shell of himself. He's cursed with boils. He's cursed with pain. He's cursed with a disposition where whenever his friends finally show up, they don't even recognize him. That's how bad he looks. But in verse number 9 of Job chapter 2, go ahead and read Job chapter 9, Job chapter 2, verse number 9. Job's wife, when Job is sitting in this, he looks terrible. He feels terrible. And his wife comes up to him and she says, dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die. Now, I want you to stop before you think anything ill of Mrs. Job. Because Mrs. Job is not an evil lady. She is an exhausted lady. And she is a lady who just had a mindset and just had a thought pass through that probably many who suffer have come through at some point in their life. And the whisper that she gives to Job is just quit. Just give up. Why are you still serving? There's nothing left for you. It's not worth it. Just quit. And so read verse number 10. Job gives the answer, and he says, shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? In all of this did not Job sin with his lips. Now I bring this up because we have a choice to be made. The question behind whether or not we will remain faithful is the question of, do I serve God for nothing? Do I serve God even if there's no physical benefit from me serving God? And so as Job goes through this, and as he lives, and you see the next 30 plus chapters as he's going through his friends, they deal with the argument, the theological argument of why Job is suffering. His friends have a very neat and tidy view of the world. They say, Job, you're suffering because you have done something against God. You have sinned against God, and that is why you are suffering to this point. And Job's response to them time and time again is that I have been faithful. That there are cases that we can demonstrate and see in our life where it is not always those who are the faithful ones that succeed, or the faithful ones that have perfect health, or the faithful ones that never have problems. And so by the end of the book of Job, we're given a conclusion that Job keeps his faithfulness, keeps his integrity, and never understands why these things happen to him, but through it all, keeps his faith to God. Question for you and I, do we serve God for nothing? Now, I want us to think back and think for a moment of the why. That's always the question we want to know, is the why. Why am I going through this? Why is it me that has to go through it? Why am I the one with problems? And that's a question Job could have asked 100 different times as you go through the book of Job. Why me, and why is this happening now? But I want us to pause there and go over to the New Testament for a moment. I want you to open your Bibles now to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And I want you to look specifically in verses 7 to 10 with me. Because we open up, and now that we have the answer to the question of, am I serving God for nothing? Now we understand that there may be more behind suffering than just meets the eye. More behind chronic pain. More behind these illnesses of things we can do in our life and how to deal with these problems. Whenever you open up in 2 Corinthians 12, begin verse number 7 with me. It says, "And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, and persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong." Now, stop there at the end of verse number 10. Before we go any further in this, the first thing that I want to try to provide is the context we skip a lot of times from 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Remember that Paul is writing to a congregation that has been led astray by false teachers, that have had a problem with false teachers. And one of the problems that they have is that they are measuring who an apostle is by his strength and success, by how strong he is. And their mindset is the same as Job's friends. Well, if you are powerful and prosperous, then you must be from God. And if you are weak and suffering, then you must have sinned. You must have had some problem in this life. And to be honest with you, that is the same thing that's said to many faithful Christians today. Well, if you just had enough faith, then you would be healed. Well, if you just prayed more, then you would be healed. Well, maybe God is trying to tell you something about your life, or as if they have not prayed or asked for these things to be removed for years. Well, the reality is, Paul's response to this is in verse number 7 through 10 of 2 Corinthians 12. And as he is writing this, he says something that is very different than what they're used to. He talks about boasting in his weakness. Now, you stop and think for a second that is kind of an oxymoron in how you and I think. Boasting in weakness, being proud in weakness, overcoming in weakness is not something we attribute boasting to strength, to positions of power. And Paul's saying, he says, no, that's not exactly how it works. So I want you to look at verse number 7 with me. Because there's two things happening here at the same exact time. There's a dual purpose framework that we have going on here. And as you read through and you think about what exactly is happening, I want you to look specifically in verse number 7. It talks about the same exact thing, the same exact form, but there are two agents and there are two purposes. And you have God's purpose versus Satan's purpose, and it is the exact same form. Now, God's purpose, as you read verse number 7, lest I should be exalted above measure. That's stated twice. It's emphasized twice. God is using suffering. He is using it as a way to maintain humility and dependence. But Satan, on the other hand, he's saying the same exact thing. He says, no. Paul says the messenger of Satan to buffet me. That word buffet means to strike with fist. It means to hit repeatedly, relentlessly, getting beaten. And that's Paul saying that thorn has two different people telling me two different things. God is saying, use this to be more dependent, have more faith. Satan is beating me with it to say over and over again to give up. And the question of Paul is, which person's purpose is he going to go with? Because you have the same problem. Satan intends destruction. He intends to tear people down. God intends to formulate people, to have a formation. And you ever thought that the same suffering that Satan intends to destroy you with is perhaps the same one God is using to shape you? That perhaps it's the same one using us to be dependent? You know, even the cross was both, wasn't it? Even the cross, that same form, Satan used wicked men to crucify the Son of God. God used that same cross to save the world. Paul will say that in Acts chapter 4, verse 28. Peter will say that. And as you read through that and you think about what exactly does Paul do, I want you to look specifically in verse number 8 again. It says that he prayed. And he did not pray, it says casually. How many times did he pray? 3 times he prayed, a very earnest, a very specific prayer. And what did he ask? Lord, take this away. And what did God say? No. Now that's not a lesson you maybe want to hear or heard preached, but there's a reason behind this. Because now Paul's going to wake up the next morning with the same thorn, the next morning after that, and the next. And I'm preaching this, and some of you know exactly what that's feeling like. It's more than just a sermon. You know exactly what he's going through. You prayed that prayer. You may have not prayed it 3 times. You may have prayed it 300 times, and yet you still have that thorn. God told his own apostle Paul, no. When we think about when he told his own apostle Paul, no, who did God the Father also tell, no, there was no other way? As he prayed for a different way in the Garden of Gethsemane in Matthew 26. As Jesus is praying in the garden and asking if there be any other way to let this cup pass from me, God the Father said what? No. There is no other way. Paul and Jesus have one thing that is very much in common. They both were told no, and yet they both still submitted to God, even though it may not have been what they asked for, even though it may not have been what they wanted. And so if God will say no to his own son and the Apostle Paul, maybe we shouldn't be shocked if that answer is no for you and I today. Maybe there's more to this. Maybe there's something about this that we can use. Now, this is the right thing to pray for healing. In fact, we're told in James to ask for healing, to pray for those who are sick. Paul did it. Jesus did it. But that's when we read the rest of this text, as we read verse number 9. So go down to verse number 9. The answer to Paul's prayer was not just no. The answer to Paul's prayer was, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. And as I read through that, and as I read through what is happening here, you think back to what exactly Paul prayed for and what he received. When you think about this strength that he is given, and whenever you think about what exactly is happening in his life, that idea of sufficient in verse number 9, that idea of being sufficient for Paul, that's a present tense word. And what that word means for you and I as we read through in verse 9 is that is God's grace being continuously supplied. That is a grace that does not run out. It is a grace that does not arrive in barely enough quantities. It is a grace that is enough to endure whatever we are going through and still be faithful to God. And he says something else interesting in verse 9, doesn't he? He says that he is made perfect in weakness. Now, he's not saying perfect in a way that you and I think perfect, not flawless. He's saying I am fully complete now because I am able to overcome even when I am weak. God's power does not merely tolerate weakness. That's not what it's talking about there. The weakness that Paul is talking about, this idea of relying and having a full dependence on God, is where we see God's power reach the fullest extension in our life when we fully rely and depend on Him. And so that's why sometimes that very thing we are begging God to remove is maybe the place where He is doing His deepest work in, where He is doing the work in our life to shape us. And so what Paul concluded is what we see here in verse number 10. The end of verse 9 going into verse number 10. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities. Have you ever said that in your life? I take pleasure in being sick. I was sick last week. I tell you, there's no pleasure that I found than just the physical side of being sick, is there? You all have chronic illnesses, chronic pain. That's not the pleasure Paul is talking about, though. He is talking about this idea and finding full completeness and pleasure. One of the favorite things about this verse, that word pleasure, whenever you read in Matthew 3, verse 17 of God the Father at the baptism of Christ, when he says, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased," that's the same word of well pleased used for this word pleasure. And what he is saying there is he is not gritting his teeth through this. He's not bearing down. He understands, well, if he removes the thorn, he's also going to remove the dependence that I have on him. Because I've grown to be dependent on God because I need him. And then he goes on to say something that contradicts so much of what you and I know. For when I am weak, then am I strong. He did not lose the thorn. He gained independence by it. And as you and I read down through this, we think about what we've gone through in our life. I remember a story being told years ago, a lady by the name of Fanny Crosby. And you'll recognize the name, and I'll tell you where you recognize the name. Fanny Crosby was permanently blinded at 6 weeks old because of a botched treatment a doctor had given her. This was back in the 1800s. She never saw a thing her entire life, but you've actually seen her name quite a bit, probably a lot more than just once, because she composed over 8,000 hymns. Whenever you sing Blessed Assurance, you're reading the words of Fanny Crosby. When you're singing To God Be the Glory or All the Way My Savior Leads Me, you're reading the words of that woman who was permanently blinded. And she said something later in her life. She said that if permanent sight and perfect sight was offered to me, that I would not take it. Because without this, I've been able to fulfill who I truly should have become. And you think back to all of the things you and I live in our life and all the things we go through in our life. And all the things we have had and go through, 2 Corinthians 12 and verse number 9, of remaining weak in the flesh so that we can be strong in God. I want to give you a final thought before we conclude this morning. And this is maybe a biblical reality that might not many preach. But even in the age of the miraculous, can you think back to any others who have these problems? Timothy, in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 23, was said to have had often infirmities. And Paul's prescription for him was use a little wine for his stomach's sake. He gave him medicine. He didn't give him rebuke. He said, here's what you do. Timothy was still entrusted with overseeing the church at Ephesus. Chronic weakness, chronic problems did not disqualify him, and they most certainly did not define him. How about Trophimus? In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 20, we're told about Trophimus. He was the one that was left at my leaders. Why? Because he was sick. He was sick bad enough. One of Paul's final recorded statements was on Trophimus being sick. Now, this is the same Paul writing this, by the way, who healed through handkerchiefs and aprons in Acts 19. Who had the ability, but Paul did not heal his own companion. Not that he could not have, that God's power would not have, but what are they there for? What were the miracles for? To prove ultimately who God was. And then Epaphroditus, Philippians chapter 2, verse 27, we're told Epaphroditus was sick, nigh unto death, Paul said. Sick to that point, and Paul's response, not rebuke, but given him the highest honor. Called him a companion in labor, called him his fellow soldier. Even in the age of the miraculous, there were men who got sick, faithful men, and stayed sick. There were problems that they had, and they were honored. They're not rebuked. They're not said, just have more faith. I want to give you one last text, and then we'll quit. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 35 through 39. This is after the parade of faith, miracles, deliveries, victories. The chapter turns. And in Hebrews 11, verses 35 through 39, in this Hall of Faith chapter, I want to read you a little portion of that. It says, others were tortured, not accepting deliveries. It says they were destitute, afflicted, tormented. And then it goes on, it says, and these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise. You know, the faithful did not all get healed. Some were delivered, but many were not. And God calls both groups equally faithful. I think back to the problems we have in our life and the things that we can do. Now, there's one final portion of this. We're out of time this morning to talk about. But I want you to go ahead and read a chapter for me this afternoon. We're going to talk about it tonight. The battle for perspective is what we're going to call tonight based on the same topic. And I want you to sit down this afternoon and read Psalm 73 for me. Read Psalm 73. It's not, we're going to talk about Asaph. We're going to talk about a person who had chronic illness, who had problems. And we're going to ask exactly, what can I do if I have these problems? How exactly can I overcome? We're going to close here this morning with those thoughts. The question for you and I today, do I serve God even whenever I am bad in health? Even when I have pain, even when I have problems? Do I love God and am I dependent on Him? Am I so dependent on Him that I'm able to say what Paul did, that through my weakness I am made strong? That I have that dependence on God. And just know that if you're one that has these problems, you're suffering, you know a loved one, you have somebody you know in your life that has these problems, that does not define them. It does not define you. It is what we choose to do through it that ultimately defines who exactly we are. So this morning, if you're one having these problems, know that your family's here to support you. Your brothers in Christ are here to support you. That we're here to help in any way that we can. The most important part of any of this is that this lesson is specifically given to Christians. If we're a Christian, if we're not a Christian, we're still outside of Christ. We're not able to be one that can say that through weakness we're made strong, that we're able to overcome, because first we must be obedient and dependent on God. So if you're not yet a Christian, the first thing to do going after this and going after to a life of fulfillment, even chronic problems, is to obey God, putting Christ on in baptism, serving Him. Maybe you're a Christian and you've fallen short. Maybe these problems we talked about today are why you fell short. Maybe you've got somebody in your life that's fallen away because of these things. Maybe you're just one that needs encouragement. But the invitation is open for anybody. It's open now as Gary's about to get ready to sing this song. And it's also open at any time we can help. That's what we're here for as a family. But this morning, if there's a need, we can help you in any way. Please come forward now. Let's go. We stand and sing this song of encouragement.